What do you do when your own father takes away your only home in front of dozens of staring eyes in a courtroom? You might break down, but I need you to stay and listen. The end of that trial did not just expose a ruthless hypocrite, it uncovered a shocking secret bought with blood and courage beneath the mud of a massive natural disaster. You will never believe who walked through those doors at the final minute. Hello to all our wonderful listeners here on Haley Revenge Stories, and thank you so deeply for tuning in today. Unfortunately, YouTube has completely demonetized our channel, leaving us with absolutely zero budget to keep the lights on and pay our dedicated staff who work hard to bring these experiences to life. If you find yourself captivated by today's episode, please consider supporting our team with just a $1 donation by scanning the PayPal QR code currently on your screen, or by clicking the secure link located in the video description or the pinned comment below. My name is Autumn Ross, and I am 31 years old. The air inside the downtown Denver, Colorado courtroom was so intensely thick and suffocating that it felt exactly like breathing through a heavy, damp wool blanket. Across the vast expanse of the polished mahogany table, my father, the famously ruthless billionaire real estate tycoon Richard Ross, aggressively tossed the final drafted verdict down. The crisp legal paper hit the wood with a sharp, dismissive slap that echoed off the high walls. A triumphant, venomous smile slowly stretched across his aging face as he leaned far back into his plush leather chair, crossing his arms like a king who had just conquered a peasant village. "Go live on the streets," he stated, his voice dripping with an icy, calculated contempt that chilled me to the bone. "Let us see exactly how many days you survive out there without the shelter of the Ross family name." The bitter irony was that the grand dispute bringing us into this sterile, emotionally bankrupt arena was not fought over some massive corporate empire, a fleet of luxury cars, or a multi-million-dollar cash inheritance. It was over a simple, quiet suburban glass greenhouse. That small, fragile patch of blooming earth and tempered glass was the absolute last keepsake I possessed of my late mother. It was a modest property placed into a private trust specifically designed for me. Yet Richard and his golden child, Derek, the infinitely pampered son from his second marriage, could not even allow me to keep that tiny sanctuary. Together they had paid exorbitant fees to high-powered attorneys to expertly exploit an obscure, cruel legal loophole. They presented a meticulously fabricated narrative to the court, arguing with straight faces that I was financially and mentally incompetent to manage my own affairs or the property. Their true motive was as sick as it was desperate. The almighty, seemingly untouchable Ross Family Company was secretly spiraling rapidly toward bankruptcy, bleeding money behind closed doors. They fully intended to seize my mother's greenhouse, liquidate the underlying land, and use every single cent as collateral to desperately patch up their mounting corporate debts. I stood completely alone in the center of the vast courtroom, a solitary, tired figure standing against an arrogant army of expensive tailored suits. I did not shed a single tear for them. Instead, a bitter, hollow laugh clawed its way up my throat and escaped my lips. It was purely agonizing to witness the sheer, unadulterated cruelty of my own flesh and blood. I watched in silent disgust as they openly smeared my honor, aggressively mocked my life choices, and degraded my chosen profession just to steal the one pure thing I still loved. They shamelessly painted my grueling, life-saving career as the reckless, unpaid delusion of an unstable mind. High up on his elevated wooden bench, Judge Harrison loomed over the entire room like a hawk. He was a notoriously stern, unyielding man, widely known throughout Denver County as the Iron Judge, who never let emotions sway a ruling. His large, wrinkled hand gripped the heavy wooden gavel, raising it slowly into the stagnant air. He was fully prepared to slam it down and grant the foreclosure order that would officially legally erase my mother's memory from my life forever. But the gavel never fell. Judge Harrison froze completely mid-motion, his arms suspended awkwardly in the air. Slowly and with a strange, deliberate caution, he lowered the wooden hammer back onto the desk without making a single sound. He reached up his fingers, trembling ever so slightly, and pulled the wire-rimmed reading glasses from his face. He leaned heavily over the polished edge of his desk, squinting down at me with an intensity that burned. His piercing eyes locked not on my face but squarely on my chest. I was wearing my worn, heavy-duty flight uniform. The thick fire-resistant fabric was frayed at the edges from battling harsh weather and rough terrain, bearing a slightly faded, intricately stitched logo right over my heart. The judge's rigidly professional, utterly indifferent expression shattered into a million pieces instantly. It was replaced by a look of absolute breathtaking shock that drained the color from his cheeks. He stared at the dirt-smudged emblem on my chest, as if he had just seen an angel descend from the ceiling, and the heavy oppressive silence that suddenly consumed the entire courtroom was so profound you could hear the chaotic thumping of my own heart. The sprawling 20,000-square-foot Ross estate, situated in the exclusive hills of Cherry Hills Village, was designed to be a showcase of unimaginable wealth. Yet after my mother passed away from a sudden illness when I was only 10 years old, that massive mansion transformed instantly into an icy, echoing mausoleum. I quickly became a ghost haunting its endless, perfectly vacuumed corridors. To the billionaire patriarch of the family, I was never a grieving daughter in need of comfort. I was a defect. I was a persistent, highly annoying reminder of the only woman who ever possessed the courage to tell him no. I inherited her fiercely independent spirit, her stubborn jawline, and her absolute refusal to kneel before the altar of his immense fortune. Because I would not play the role of the compliant, silent trophy daughter, I was systematically erased from his affections. The contrast within those walls was nauseating. Enter Derek, the golden child, born to my father's much younger, highly ambitious second wife. While I was deliberately excluded from family portraits and holiday vacations, Derek was paraded around elite country clubs and exclusive corporate galas like a prize stallion. Every conceivable obstacle in his life was removed heavily padded with stacks of cash. If Derek crashed a luxury sports car into a ditch after a night of heavy drinking, a team of aggressive lawyers ensured the police reports simply vanished into thin air. If he failed his university exams because he was too busy partying on private yachts, a massive, anonymous donation to the Alumni Association miraculously secured his passing grades. By the time he was merely 24 years old, a customized high-backed leather chair was already waiting for him on the executive board of directors. He was meticulously molded in my father's exact image, perfectly trained to view other human beings merely as stepping stones or disposable assets. I refused to let that poison infect my veins. On the exact day I turned 18 years old, I packed a single faded canvas duffel bag, walked out through those imposing wrought-iron security gates, and never once looked back. I deliberately left behind the multi-million-dollar trust funds, the glittering designer wardrobes, and the suffocating toxicity of that corrupted bloodline. I fiercely craved a life of actual tangible substance. I was utterly determined to forge my own identity and build my self-worth entirely with my own two hands, far away from the filthy, manipulative empire my father worshipped. I wanted to earn my place in the world, not inherit it through a rigged, soulless system. That desperate hunger for a genuine purpose eventually led me straight to the cracked, oil-stained tarmac of Vanguard Aero Rescue. We were a highly specialized, privately funded, non-governmental rapid response organization. We were the reckless souls who flew directly into the terrifying jaws of natural disasters when every sane person was frantically evacuating. I did not buy my way into the pilot seat. I spent years grinding through brutally unforgiving flight academies, suffering through freezing wilderness survival courses, and logging thousands of punishing flight hours to become a fully certified elite search and rescue helicopter pilot. The divide between my two worlds could not have been more extreme. While my father sat comfortably in climate-controlled downtown penthouses, swirling $1,000 glasses of aged scotch, and openly mocking me to his wealthy peers as a pathetic, wage-earning failure, I was discovering what true family actually meant. True family was not determined by shared genetics or a prestigious last name. Family was the exhausted chief mechanic who stayed awake until 3 in the morning. meticulously checking my rotor blades to ensure I would not drop out of the sky. Family was the fearless co-pilot who trusted me implicitly with his own life while navigating through zero-visibility hurricanes and blinding blizzards. Family was the countless terrified, freezing survivors we physically pulled from the roofs of submerged houses during catastrophic floods and from the edges of raging, out-of-control wildfires. Whenever my name was brought up at my father's dinner parties, he predictably scoffed at my modest paycheck. He loudly called my chosen career a blue-collar joke, a pathetic rebellion of a confused, ungrateful child who could not cut it in the real business world. He never once bothered to look past the mud caked on my heavy work boots or the permanent grease stains under my fingernails. The entire Ross family simply wrote me off as a tragic financial disaster solely because my bank account balance did not end with 7 or 8 zeros. They possessed absolutely no concept of the fierce, bleeding reality of my daily existence. They did not know the incredibly sharp smell of aviation fuel mixed with pure adrenaline. They could never comprehend the heavy, soul-crushing responsibility of physically holding a fragile human life in the palm of your hand while simultaneously fighting against gravity-collapsing structures and gale-force winds. To those arrogant people in their tailored suits, I was nothing but a massive disappointment. But to the desperate people pulling themselves out of the shattered rubble of their broken lives, I was the rhythmic, thumping sound of helicopter rotors beating against a dark sky promising them that salvation had finally arrived. The Cascade Mountains in the Pacific Northwest are breathtakingly beautiful during the summer months, but they can quickly become an unforgiving, deadly nightmare when the weather turns hostile. Exactly 2 years ago, a storm system of unprecedented violence stalled directly over those towering peaks. It was not just a heavy downpour. It was a catastrophic atmospheric river that dumped historic levels of rainfall onto heavily saturated, unstable terrain. The steep mountain slopes, already severely weakened by previous years of commercial logging operations, finally surrendered to the weight of the water. A massive, terrifying landslide triggered a roaring flash flood of thick mud giant boulders and shattered timber that tore down the mountain valley in the dead of night. The violent torrent completely wiped a small, isolated valley town off the map, instantly cutting off all power grids, communication lines, and access roads, leaving dozens of stranded, terrified residents facing imminent death. The emergency scramble sirens at our Vanguard base pierced the freezing night air at exactly 2 o'clock in the morning. When my rescue crew lifted off the tarmac, the turbulence was so unimaginably violent that it felt like our heavy search and rescue helicopter was a fragile plastic toy being violently shaken by an angry giant. The wind shear was registering at over 80 miles per hour, tossing the 10,000-pound aircraft around the pitch-black sky with terrifying ease. The freezing rain lashed against the reinforced glass of the cockpit, creating a blinding, hypnotic wall of water. Visibility was absolutely zero. Inside the cockpit, the only illumination came from the harsh red glow of the instrument panels and the rapid, anxiety-inducing flashing of the altitude warning lights. Through my noise-canceling headset, the radio traffic was a grim, steady chorus of defeat. One by one, I listened to veteran pilots from the Coast Guard and the state police solemnly calling in their abort codes. The weather was simply too chaotic, and the risk of a fatal crash was mathematically too high. Finally, the main command center broadcasted a desperate final order. All aircraft, this is command. Abort the mission and return to base immediately. The weather window has closed. Repeat, all aircraft stand down. My co-pilot, a seasoned veteran with graying hair, looked over at me, his hands white-knuckled on the secondary controls. He gave a single heavy nod, silently agreeing with the recall order. I reached out my gloved fingers, hovering over the comm switch to formally acknowledge the abort command. But then, as the helicopter banked sharply to the left to turn around, I caught a fleeting glimpse of something below. It was a faint, desperate pulse of light cutting through the driving horizontal rain. A flashlight. It was blinking rhythmically from the very bottom of a steep, heavily wooded ravine that was rapidly filling with churning liquid earth. I stared at the blinking light for exactly 2 seconds. I knew what the strict safety regulations demanded. I knew the extreme danger to my crew. But I also knew what it meant to be abandoned in the dark when you needed help the most. I keyed the microphone. Negative command. I have visual confirmation on a survivor. We are going in. I did not wait for their furious screaming response. I instantly engaged the hover assist systems and handed the primary flight controls over to my deeply stunned co-pilot. I threw off my headset, unbuckled my 4-point harness, and scrambled into the freezing, rain-swept rear cabin. I shouted over the deafening, bone-rattling roar of the twin-turbine engines to my crew chief, telling him to prep the winch. I stepped out onto the wet metal skid, the gale-force winds immediately trying to tear me off the side of the aircraft. I clipped the heavy steel carabiner to my chest harness, gave the thumbs-down signal, and dropped into the black void. The descent felt like an eternity. The freezing rain pelted my face and neck, stinging like a swarm of angry wasps. As I neared the violent surface, the smell of ruptured pine trees, broken gas lines, and raw, wet earth was entirely suffocating. The mud was a ravenous, thick monster rising rapidly around a crushed, silver sedan that was teetering dangerously on the very edge of a sheer cliff drop-off. The entire chassis of the car groaned and shrieked as the shifting earth pushed heavily against its side. I unhooked from the hoist cable, entirely knowing that if the car went over the edge while I was tethered, the massive weight would drag the helicopter out of the sky with it. I slipped and slid across the dented hood, fighting violently to keep my balance as the ground literally shifted beneath my heavy boots. Peering through the cracked, mud-slathered window of the driver's side door, I finally saw him. A young man, his face pale and heavily battered, was barely conscious. The violently crumpled dashboard had collapsed completely inward, pinning his left leg with the crushing weight of a steel vise. Freezing muddy water was already rising up to his chest inside the cabin. He weakly tapped the flashlight against the glass one last time before his hand dropped into the water. There was zero time to call down heavy hydraulic extraction tools from the chopper. I pulled the heavy steel emergency hammer from my tactical belt and swung it with every ounce of frantic strength I had directly into the safety glass. The reinforced window shattered inward, the jagged edges slicing deeply through my thick Kevlar gloves and tearing right into the bare skin of my forearms. Warm blood instantly mixed with the freezing rain, but the sheer adrenaline pumping through my veins completely erased the pain. I reached my bleeding arms through the jagged hole, desperately grabbing the thick collar of his heavy winter jacket. "Listen to me. You need to help me pull," I screamed over the howling storm, though his eyes were rolling back in his head. He was slipping rapidly into severe hypothermic shock. I wedged my boots aggressively against the doorframe, grabbed the twisted steering column, and pulled upward with a frantic, desperate force using my own body weight as a raw lever. Miraculously, the twisted metal groaned and shifted just a fraction of an inch. It was enough. I grabbed the young man by the shoulders and dragged his limp, heavy body out through the shattered window just as a massive wave of thick mud surged completely over the trunk, pushing the vehicle dangerously closer to the ledge. I fumbled frantically with the heavy metal clips of my rescue harness, securing him tightly to my chest. I grabbed the violently swinging hoist cable, hooked us in securely, and screamed into the radio microphone attached to my shoulder. "Pull us up! Pull us up, right now!" The powerful mechanical winch jerked us violently into the freezing air. We were dangling barely 10 feet above the hood of the car when the earth finally surrendered completely. With a sickening, deafening roar that vibrated deep in my chest, the entire ledge beneath us simply gave way. The crushed sedan, along with thousands of tons of heavy mud giant rocks and massive ancient tree roots, broke loose and plummeted instantly into the black, bottomless abyss below. The tremendous aerodynamic suction created by the falling debris pulled fiercely at my boots, spinning us wildly on the thin steel cable. If we had stayed on that hood for just 5 more seconds, we would have been dragged down into the darkness and buried forever under a mountain of stone. I held the unconscious young man tightly against my chest as we were slowly pulled up toward the open belly of the hovering helicopter, watching the exact spot where we had just been standing vanish entirely into the void. When the crew chief finally dragged us over the lip of the cabin floor, the young man was completely unresponsive. He had slipped into a deep, dangerous coma, his pulse terrifyingly weak against my cold fingers. We flew back to the makeshift medical triage zone at maximum speed, touching down on the flooded tarmac just long enough to transfer his limp body over to the frantic, screaming paramedic teams waiting in the pouring rain. Later that night, sitting completely alone in the freezing, harsh fluorescent light of the base locker room, the adrenaline finally crashed. I looked down at my hands. They were violently shaking, completely covered in drying mud and deep bleeding lacerations from the shattered car window glass. I quietly cleaned and bandaged my own shredded arms in front of a cracked mirror, listening to the rain pound relentlessly against the tin roof. Due to the strict privacy and security protocols of our organization at that specific time, I filed a completely anonymous incident report, listing myself only as Pilot Echo 4. I washed the blood off my uniform, packed my gear, and went right back to the flight line the very next morning. I never breathed a single word of that horrifying night to my family. There was no point. They would never understand, and frankly, they never cared enough to ask where I went when the dark storms rolled in. The deafening silence inside the Denver courtroom stretched out, becoming incredibly heavy and absolute. The dust motes danced slowly in the pale shafts of light, cutting through the high architectural windows, completely undisturbed by any sudden movements. Up on the elevated bench, Judge Harrison, a man who habitually commanded the entire room with a casual, intimidating flick of his wrist, gripped the thick edge of his mahogany desk. His knuckles turned completely white from the strain. He pushed his tall frame up, rising slowly to his feet. His hands were visibly shaking, a microscopic tremor that betrayed a massive internal earthquake. "Miss Ross," he said. His voice was entirely stripped of its usual booming theatrical authority. It was a raw, trembling whisper that somehow carried perfectly to every single corner of the vaulted room. "The faded patch on your uniform. That is Vanguard Aero Rescue. Were you officially deployed to the Cascade Mountain Range exactly 2 years ago during the massive flash flood emergency?" I blinked momentarily, thrown off balance by the bizarre sudden shift in judicial protocol. I kept my posture rigidly straight, my chin held high. "Yes, Your Honor. I was part of the initial response team." "What was your assigned pilot call sign for that specific night deployment?" he demanded, the urgency in his heavily strained tones spiking sharply. "I was designated as Pilot Echo 4, I replied evenly, looking directly into his eyes. Judge Harrison closed his eyes tightly. A profound, shuddering breath racked his broad chest, causing the heavy black fabric of his judicial robe to heave. When he finally opened his eyes again, they were shining brilliantly with unshed tears. Right there in front of the armed bailiffs, the furiously typing court reporters, and the entire gallery of stunned spectators, the most feared, ruthless judge in the county stepped back from his podium. He lowered his shoulders and bowed his head deeply toward me. It was not a simple, polite nod. It was a physical surrender of his immense ego, a public gesture of absolute, infinite gratitude that defied every rule of courtroom decorum. "The woman that you are all so eagerly trying to trample into the dirt today," the judge announced, his voice suddenly echoing with a thunderous, righteous clarity, "is the exact same guardian angel who gave birth to my son a second time." The entire courtroom erupted instantly into a chaotic symphony of loud gasps, shuffling feet, and frantic overlapping whispers. I snapped my head toward the plaintiff table. My father, Richard Ross, looked exactly as though he had just been violently struck across the face with a heavy iron board. The sickening, triumphant smirk that had been permanently plastered on his lips for the last 2 hours completely dissolved. It was instantly replaced by a slack-jawed mask of pure, unadulterated confusion and rising panic. Beside him, my pampered half-brother Derek suddenly found his expensive silk tie entirely too tight. He began violently squirming in his heavy wooden seat, aggressively wiping a thick sheen of nervous sweat from his forehead with a monogrammed linen handkerchief. Judge Harrison completely ignored the rising clamor from the gallery. He looked only at me, his expression radiating a painful vulnerability. For 2 long years, my wife and I have desperately searched every aviation registry, filed countless Freedom of Information requests, and spent thousands of dollars trying to find the true identity of pilot Echo 4. On that terrible, cursed night, we sat paralyzed by the telephone in pure, suffocating agony for 48 consecutive hours, entirely believing our only child was buried forever at the bottom of a muddy ravine. When the trauma hospital finally called us, the lead surgeon told us a rogue helicopter pilot had shattered a sinking car window with her bare hands just seconds before the earth gave way. My son was trapped in a deep, unresponsive coma for 3 solid weeks. But he woke up. He is alive today, breathing and walking this earth solely because you courageously refused to follow an official order to turn back. The beautiful, heavy gravity of that profound revelation was abruptly shattered by the abrasive, ugly scrape of a wooden chair. Richard, desperately scrambling to regain control of his meticulously rigged game, forced a booming, entirely hollow laugh. He aggressively buttoned his bespoke suit jacket and cleared his throat loudly, attempting to suck the oxygen back out of the room. "Well, Your Honor, that is certainly a very touching, heartwarming little coincidence," my father sneered, his tone dripping with acidic condescension. "We are all very thrilled for your family. Truly we are. However, playing hero in the mud is essentially a glorified, unpaid hobby. It does not pay the utility bills. It does not erase the fact that she is financially destitute and entirely incapable of managing a valuable real estate trust. This trivial matter of a rescue mission has absolutely 0% bearing on her undeniable bankruptcy, or the legal foreclosure of the greenhouse currently in question. That was his fatal mistake. Richard had spent his entire life aggressively bullying people into submission, operating under the arrogant assumption that his immense wealth made him completely invincible. He profoundly miscalculated the man sitting on the bench. Judge Harrison stopped crying. The overwhelming warmth and human vulnerability that had flooded his face just moments before vanished instantly. His expression flash-froze into a terrifying mask of pure, cold fury. He slowly sat back down in his high-backed leather chair. He did not yell. He did not bang his heavy wooden gavel. Instead, he reached out with an eerie, deliberate precision and picked up the thick, heavy manila folder containing the Ross family legal demands. He slowly adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses, sliding them firmly back onto the bridge of his nose. The way he looked down at my father now was no longer with the impartial professional skepticism of a judge. It was with the lethal, predatory focus of a seasoned hunter who had just spotted a fatal limp in his prey. He opened the file, his sharp eyes sweeping over the meticulously prepared financial ledgers with a completely new, devastatingly critical level of scrutiny. The legendary Iron Judge of Denver was back, but this time, his infamous wrath was pointed directly at the arrogant billionaire sitting across from him. Instead of picking up his heavy wooden gavel to finalize the eviction, Judge Harrison slapped his large palm flat against the thick manila folder resting on his bench. The sharp smack echoed like a gunshot. "Counselor!" The judge barked, his voice cutting through the thick air like a serrated blade. "Before I even consider authorizing a single legal action in this courtroom today, I require an immediate, highly detailed explanation regarding Section 4, Paragraph B of your client's financial disclosure forms." Richard's lead attorney, a remarkably slick, overpaid partner at a prestigious downtown firm, hastily scrambled to his feet. He nervously adjusted the knot of his expensive silk tie, suddenly looking incredibly small and fragile under the judge's intense predatory glare. "Your Honor, those are simply standard asset liquidation protocols intended to streamline the management of the estate. Do not dare insult my intelligence in my own courtroom," Judge Harrison snapped, leaning dangerously far over his desk. "I have spent over 30 years aggressively untangling complex corporate fraud. I am looking right now at a disturbing series of highly irregular, completely undocumented cash transfers siphoned directly out of the protected trust fund originally established by the late Mrs. Ross. These secretive transfers began exactly 7 years ago. Furthermore, there is a glaring, massive logical contradiction at the very core of your entire argument. The judge brought his hands together, steepling his fingers perfectly, as he locked eyes with the trembling lawyer. Your client, Mr. Richard Ross, claims his global real estate conglomerate is currently experiencing unprecedented record-breaking profits. You have spent the last 2 hours parading his supposed financial invincibility around my courtroom, trying to paint him as a flawless titan of industry. If that is the absolute truth, I want you to look me in the eye and explain why a supposed billionaire is employing such aggressive, borderline illegal, and frankly desperate tactics to seize a tiny dilapidated glass greenhouse in the distant suburbs. Why is a man of his immense stature so utterly obsessed with a plot of dirt that is barely half an acre in size? The heavy silence that crashed down on the room was absolutely suffocating. The lawyer opened his mouth, closed it again, and nervously shuffled his stack of crisp legal papers. He glanced down at Richard, his eyes silently begging his arrogant client for a lifeline. Beside my father, Derek was now visibly trembling. His face had turned the horrifying color of spoiled milk, and he was wiping cold sweat from his neck. Well, I am waiting for your brilliant legal explanation, Judge Harrison commanded. Your Honor, the property holds deep sentimental value to the family, and my client simply wishes to cleanly consolidate his physical assets. The lawyer stammered, his voice cracking noticeably on the final word. Sentimental value. The judge let out a short, harsh bark of a laugh that contained absolutely zero humor. Are you honestly standing in my courtroom under the strict penalty of perjury, claiming that a man who just gleefully told his own biological daughter to go live on the streets is acting out of deep familial sentimentality? That is a bold strategy. Let us look at the power of attorney documents you filed to bypass Miss Ross's legal rights to her mother's trust. Judge Harrison held up a faded piece of paper, pinching it between 2 fingers as if it were coated in poison. This specific document is dated exactly 6 years ago. It boldly claims Miss Ross willingly surrendered all administrative control of her assets to her father. However, the signature right here at the bottom does not match a single verified document in her public legal record. The ink stroke pressure is entirely wrong. The loop on the final letter is incredibly hesitant. It strongly appears to be a very clumsy, deeply amateurish forgery. The courtroom gallery collectively gasped. My own heart pounded fiercely against my ribs. I had never signed any such document in my entire life. I had walked away when I was 18 years old and had never accepted a single pen or penny from that man since. Judge Harrison did not stop his relentless assault. He was a seasoned predator successfully closing in on the final kill. Let me save us all a tremendous amount of wasted time today. I had my clerks run a preliminary independent background check on the Ross corporate holdings this morning simply as a matter of standard judicial procedure. It turns out the mighty untouchable Ross empire is nothing but a rapidly crumbling house of cards. Your client is drowning in catastrophic debt from a long series of disastrous overseas investments. You are over-leveraged by hundreds of millions of dollars. Your major international creditors are legally calling in their massive loans by the end of this exact month. My father's face shifted instantly from pale, arrogant shock to a deep, dangerous, boiling crimson. He gripped the heavy edge of the plaintiff table so hard his knuckles looked completely ready to burst right through his skin. But that still leaves the lingering question of the tiny greenhouse, the judge continued smoothly, his eyes locked firmly onto my father's shaking frame. That was a mystery until I closely examined the geological survey reports filed quietly with the State Environmental Protection Agency exactly 3 weeks ago. It seems that specific suburban zip code sits directly on top of one of the largest newly discovered veins of rare earth minerals in the entire state. We are talking about precious elements absolutely crucial for manufacturing modern electronics and green energy technology. That insignificant little patch of dirt buried under the glass greenhouse is suddenly worth tens of millions of dollars. You did not want to take your daughter's only home because she was financially incompetent. You desperately needed to steal her last inheritance to save yourself from absolute financial ruin and federal bankruptcy. The horrific truth dropped right into the exact middle of the room like a live ticking grenade. The entire polished facade of the untouchable billionaire shattered instantly into a million sharp, ugly pieces. Richard completely lost his mind. He shoved his heavy, expensive leather chair backward so violently that it crashed loudly onto the polished wooden floor. He slammed both of his tightly balled fists down onto the mahogany table. "It is my land!" He roared, his voice completely raw and unhinged, spraying angry saliva across the defense table. "I built this entire family. I built the goddamn empire." Her mother was nothing but a weak, pathetic fool who did not understand business, and she is exactly the same. I am the patriarch of this family. I am legally entitled to every single cent that bears the Ross name. I will not let my magnificent legacy be destroyed because this ungrateful, arrogant little brat wants to play in the dirt with some dead flowers. I will destroy you. I will buy this entire court, and I will destroy you. He was screaming wildly. His previously impeccable custom suit violently wrinkled, his silver hair completely disheveled, and his eyes bulging with a manic, terrifying desperation. Derek was actively cowering behind him, physically terrified of the raging monster his father had fully become in front of the world. The armed court bailiffs instantly stepped forward from the shadows, resting their strong hands firmly on their duty belts, fully ready to physically restrain the flailing, broken billionaire. I stood perfectly still in the exact center of the chaotic courtroom, silently watching the spectacular, total meltdown of the man who had relentlessly terrorized my entire existence. For the absolute first time in my 31 years of life, I did not see a terrifying, omnipotent giant standing before me. I did not see an invincible titan of modern industry. I just saw a sad, pathetic, deeply cowardly little man who had spent his entire life desperately hiding his own miserable failures behind a thick, hollow wall of stolen money. The terrifying, freezing shadow he had cast over my entire childhood completely evaporated in the warm, unforgiving light of the absolute truth. As the two heavily armed court bailiffs took a firm step forward, resting their hands on their utility belts to physically restrain him, my father's raging, unhinged bravado suddenly collapsed into a pathetic, desperate display of sheer cowardice. The terrifying billionaire who had relentlessly tormented me for my entire life vanished, replaced by a cornered rat frantically looking for a dark hole to hide in. He instantly spun around and aggressively pointed a trembling finger directly at his own golden child. "I did not forge those trust documents," Richard shrieked, his voice cracking with a high-pitched, hysterical panic. "It was the boy. Derek handled the estate transfers. Derek and the head of the accounting department orchestrated the entire thing behind my back. I am completely innocent. I was manipulated by my own staff and my greedy son." Derek gasped loudly, his face draining of all remaining color as he stared at the man who had just ruthlessly thrown him directly under a moving bus to save his own skin. He opened his mouth to protest, but before a single word could escape his lips, the heavy, solid oak double doors at the very back of the courtroom swung violently open. The loud, booming thud echoed through the high vaulted ceiling, instantly freezing the chaos in the room. Every head in the gallery turned. A young man stepped slowly across the threshold. He was leaning heavily on a thick wooden medical cane, his left leg braced with a rigid metal support frame. His gait was slow and visibly painful, but his posture was completely unyielding. As he moved down the center aisle into the bright, pooling light of the courtroom, my breath caught fiercely in my throat. I recognized the sharp angle of his jaw and the deep, intense color of his eyes. It was the exact same face I had desperately pulled from the sinking, shattered window of a crushed silver sedan in the freezing, pouring rain exactly 2 years ago. Judge Harrison stood up so fast, his heavy leather chair slammed against the back wall. "Julian," the judge breathed out, a profound mixture of immense relief and deep confusion washing over his stern features. Julian Harrison walked deliberately past the gallery, ignoring the frantic whispers of the crowd, and came to a halt right beside my legal table. He turned to me, and for a long, silent moment, he simply looked into my eyes. There was an entire lifetime of unspoken gratitude, of shared survival communicating in that single glance. He offered a small, deeply respectful nod, then slowly turned his body to face the elevated judicial bench and the pale, sweating figures at the plaintiff table. "I deeply apologize for interrupting the official proceedings, Your Honor," Julian said, his voice calm, clear, and projecting absolute authority. "But considering the severe criminal nature of the evidence currently being discussed, my immediate presence was legally mandated." Richard scoffed desperately, trying to summon back his shattered arrogance. "And who the hell are you supposed to be? Some random hiker she pulled out of the mud. This is a private, sealed family civil matter. You have absolutely zero jurisdiction here." Julian turned his head slightly, fixing my father with a gaze so cold it could have frozen boiling water. "My name is Julian Harrison, and you are entirely incorrect, Mr. Ross. I am not just a hiker who got unlucky in a storm. I am a senior forensic investigator for the Federal Bureau of Investigation, specifically assigned to the Division of Corporate Financial Crimes." The sheer collective gasp that sucked the oxygen out of the courtroom was absolutely deafening. My father physically recoiled, as if he had been struck by lightning. Derek let out a pathetic whimpering sound and slumped forward onto the mahogany table, burying his face in his shaking hands. "Exactly 2 years ago," Julian continued, his voice ringing with absolute, undeniable clarity, "I was actively tracking a highly sophisticated, deeply concealed network of offshore shell companies. This network was specifically designed to aggressively launder millions of dollars stolen directly from several prominent charitable foundations. On the night the mountain collapsed, I was driving back from a secure covert meeting with a terrified corporate whistleblower. That brave individual handed over the master digital ledgers, proving every single fraudulent transaction. And the man sitting at the very center of that massive illegal web of corporate embezzlement, wire fraud, and forged trust funds is you, Richard Ross." Julian reached his free hand into the inner breast pocket of his tailored suit jacket. He slowly pulled out a small, heavily scratched, military-grade silver hard drive. It was visibly dented and permanently stained with the dark, heavy earth of the Cascade Mountains. "When the mudslide hit my car and dragged me off the edge of the cliff, I shoved this exact drive deep into my coat. When your incredible daughter shattered my window and dragged me into the sky by my jacket collar, she did not just save my physical life. She saved the absolute, irrefutable proof of your federal crimes. For 2 years, my federal task force has been painstakingly verifying every single digitized signature and tracking every hidden offshore bank account listed on this drive. We officially concluded our investigation at exactly 8 o'clock this morning." Judge Harrison stared at the battered silver hard drive, the profound realization of what had truly happened on that mountain settling deeply into his bones. The majestic poetry of the situation was absolute. The arrogant billionaire had spent his entire life destroying others only to be completely dismantled by the very man his discarded daughter had bled to save. This civil court is permanently adjourned." Judge Harrison declared, his voice ringing with the final absolute strike of a heavy iron bell. "I am immediately transferring all submitted documents, including the forged power of attorney regarding the rare earth mineral property, directly to the federal authorities." Before my father could even open his mouth to scream his pathetic, empty threats, the courtroom doors opened again. 4 federal agents dressed in dark tactical windbreakers marched briskly down the aisle. They bypassed the wooden gate, walking straight up to the plaintiff table. The loud, sharp metallic click of heavy steel handcuffs snapping tightly around Richard Ross's wrists was the single most beautiful sound I had ever heard in my entire 31 years of life. They hauled the raging, weeping billionaire to his feet, forcefully marching him and his sobbing son out of the room. They were stripped of their stolen wealth, their fake prestige, and their freedom in a matter of seconds. An hour later, I pushed open the heavy brass doors of the courthouse and stepped outside. The violent, suffocating storm of my past was entirely gone. The Denver sky above me was a brilliant, blinding, unbroken blue. The warm sun washed over my face, completely melting away the last lingering chill of the Ross family shadow. Judge Harrison and Julian were waiting quietly for me at the bottom of the wide marble steps. They were not standing there as intimidating agents of the law, but as genuine lifelong friends. Julian reached out firmly, grasping my hand silently, thanking me for the second chance at life, while I silently thanked him for handing me the key to mine. My story does not end with some forced cinematic forgiveness. There are some wounds that are far too deep, and some people who are far too toxic to ever welcome back into your heart. And that is perfectly okay. My mother's greenhouse and the vast fortune resting securely beneath it was legally returned to my name. But I did not become a corporate real estate tycoon. I made sure the trust was locked tight, and I went straight back to the loud, chaotic, beautiful tarmac of Vanguard Aero Rescue. I belong in the sky, flying toward the darkest storms, bringing light to the people who truly need it, leaving the heavy, broken chains of my past buried forever in the dirt. Thank you so much to every single one of you for taking the time to listen to my story today. I would absolutely love to know where you are tuning in from, so please let me know your city or country in the comments below. As I mentioned earlier, our channel is entirely listener-supported right now. If you felt moved by this journey and want to help us keep bringing these powerful experiences to life, please consider supporting our amazing team with just a $1 donation. You can simply scan the PayPal QR code on your screen or use the secure link provided in the video description and the pinned comment. Your generous support directly pays the salaries of our incredible staff, helping them feed their families and allowing us to continue creating better, more inspiring stories for you every single week. Thank you, stay safe, and always remember to fight for your own sky.